There is a quiet deception built into the way human evolution is taught. It is not always obvious, but it is relentless. The deception is the assumption that modern humans represent the clean outcome of a Homo sapiens success. The deception is embedded in the most popular evolutionary narrative of the last 40 years. In the classic version, Homo sapiens emerged as a clean, pure, anatomically modern population, then expanded outward in a near-miraculous wave of replacement, washing away archaic people like Neanderthals and Denisovans, leaving only small traces of their DNA behind. These traces are politely described as introgression, as if they were trivial rather than the hidden structural beams of the entire house. But the new genomics is forcing the deception to collapse. It is not collapsing slowly, it is collapsing suddenly. The most important papers in human evolutionary genetics are no longer arguing over a few percentage points of Neanderthal ancestry in Europeans, or whether the interbreeding represents one event or many. They are now revealing something deeper, more destabilizing, and far more inconvenient to the classic worldview. Archaic humans did not merely contribute a few accidental mutations to modern people. They contributed chunks of chromosome architecture. They contributed deep structural variants. They contributed regulatory machinery. In some cases, they contributed entire centromeres, massive blocks of chromosome segregation DNA that were once assumed to be nearly uniform in modern humans. That is not a little interbreeding. That is not a footnote. That is the end of the old story. Europe has often been framed as the end of the road for modern humans. A late frontier settled by a population that left Africa, entered Eurasia, and then picked up a small one-time dose of Neanderthal ancestry somewhere around 50,000 years ago. That picture is clean and easy to teach. But the genomic data that keeps accumulating is not clean at all. It all increasingly points to Eurasia as a long-lived, shifting meta-population where different human groups repeatedly expanded, contracted, vanished, locally, reappeared, and critically interbred at more than one time and in more than one place. Within that framework, Europeans are best understood not as pure Homo sapiens with a trace of Neanderthal, but as filtered hybrid survivors. Modern humans whose ancestry was repeatedly mixed, then repeatedly filtered by survival, bottlenecks, and selection across Ice Age Eurasia. This is why a new study, titled A Global Map for Introgressed Structural Variation and Selection in Humans, is such a quiet bomb. It does not shout its revolution in tabloid language. It does not declare war on the textbooks. But it should. Because once you truly grasp what it means to detect archaic structural variants and introgressed centromeres in living humans, the standard narrative becomes something like a fairy tale, a cartoon version of a brutal, tangled, ancient reality. The most powerful evidence in the paper isn't a vague claim that Neanderthals were diverse. It is something far more concrete and more damaging to the one-event mythology. The model explicitly separates the Neanderthal lineage that is sequenced and used as the reference from the Neanderthal lineage that actually contributed DNA through introgression. The authors of another study estimate a split between the sequenced Neanderthal and the introgressed Neanderthal at roughly 252,000 years ago. That is not a trivial tweak. This detail changes the entire meaning of Neanderthal introgression. It tells us that the Neanderthal ancestry that entered modern human genomes was not coming from the same Neanderthal lineage that we are looking at when we open a high-profile Neanderthal genome in a database. The introgressing Neanderthal lineage was already separated for 250,000 years from the particular Neanderthal lineage that later got sampled and sequenced. That is the quiet demolition charge under the popular idea of a single 50,000-year introgression event. If Neanderthals were one uniform population from Atlantic Europe to Siberia, then the Neanderthal would be an interchangeable entity. Any sequenced Neanderthal would represent the source population reasonably well. But what we find are ghost populations. Indeed, the paper forces the opposite conclusion. Neanderthal was already internally structured for hundreds of thousands of years. The lineage that actually contributed ancestry was not the same as the lineage captured by the sequenced Neanderthal. This means the very label Neanderthal introgression is already shorthand for something more complex. Gene flow from one branch of a broader Neanderthal network, not a single unified people. Now connect that to the older but still foundational observation from ancient genome work. Gene flow didn't only run Neanderthal into modern humans, it ran from modern humans into Neanderthals too, and at different times and into different branches. A modern human signal is especially clear in eastern Neanderthals, which is why papers on gene flow into Neanderthals focus on which Neanderthal branch received it, rather than assuming a single pan-Neanderthal pool. And more recent synthesis work has strengthened the recurrent contact framing rather than a single one-off event, including evidence for multiple waves of modern human gene flow into Neanderthals. Once you absorb what that implies, a single pulse of introgression at 50,000 years ago becomes almost impossible to defend as a literal demographic reality. A single event model depends on assumptions that the genomes do not permit. It assumes that there was essentially one relevant Neanderthal population at the time modern humans left Africa, and that this population behaved as a coherent block. It assumes that the boundary between modern human and Neanderthal was geographically narrow and temporally brief. It assumes that the Neanderthal ancestry in all later Eurasians can be explained by one contact zone, one admixture episode, and then a clean dispersal. But the paper's result makes those assumptions internally inconsistent because it shows that the Neanderthal side of the equation is not a single entity at all. The source lineage of introgression is not even the lineage represented by the sequenced Neanderthal. Here is why that matters at the deepest level. If the introgressed Neanderthal lineage split from the sequenced Neanderthal lineage around 252,000 years ago, then by 50,000 years ago, the Neanderthal world is not a single population. It is a set of diverged populations whose relationships are shaped by geography, climate barriers, local extinctions, and reconnections. In that situation, interbreeding with Neanderthals cannot be reduced to one single episode because there is no single Neanderthal population to serve as the donor. Even if modern humans had only one contact event with Neanderthals, which is already unlikely, that contact would have to occur with a particular regional branch, and later contact elsewhere would be with a different branch, and the genetic signal would not collapse into one neat pulse. It would show a mosaic pattern of ancestry, exactly what the broader archaic literature increasingly indicates for both Neanderthals and Denisovans. In other words, the paper doesn't just say Neanderthals were diverse. It mathematically encodes diversity into the model itself by requiring a donor Neanderthal lineage distinct from the sequenced Neanderthal lineage. That is effectively incompatible with the folk story version of introgression that dominates popular summaries, a one-time mixture just outside Africa, followed by a dispersal of a single hybrid founding population. The story requires simplicity on the archaic side. 1. Neanderthal. The evidence demands complexity, multiple Neanderthals, or at least multiple diverged Neanderthal branches within a structured meta-population. This is where the concept of filtered hybrid survivors becomes essential and not rhetorical. If Eurasia was a meta-population, then hybridization was not a decorative event. It was a recurring process that created genetic variation, and then Eurasia's brutal demographic cycles determined what survived. Hybridization generates combinations. Filtering removes most of them. This hybridization can be seen clearly in the OAC fossil from Romania. Filtering can happen through selection, through bottlenecks, through extinctions, and through founder effects. Europe in particular is a landscape where filtering would have been relentless. Glacial maxima, ecological fragmentation, and repeated recolonizations would have repeatedly culled lineages and repeatedly amplified whatever ancestry happened to be carried by the survivors. Under that scenario, Europeans are not recent Homo sapiens who picked up 2% Neanderthal. Europeans are the end product of repeated Eurasian filtering, where modern human populations carried different mixtures of archaic ancestry, then were repeatedly bottlenecked, expanded, replaced, and reformed. The exact archaic components that persist in modern Europeans are therefore not a perfect record of one mixing event. They are the residue that survived repeated filtering across tens of thousands of years. This is why European ancestry is not well described by purity. It is better described by survivorship. What remains after the metapopulation has repeatedly crushed variation and preserved only what could pass through. And once Neanderthal structure is admitted, the concept of a single 50,000-year introgression pulse stops being a biological explanation and becomes a statistical simplification, useful for first-order modeling but misleading as history. The unavoidable conclusion is this. If the Neanderthal ancestry entering modern humans came from a Neanderthal lineage that was not the same as the later sequenced lineage, then Neanderthal introgression is not the inheritance of a single people. It is the inheritance of a structured, archaic world. This also harmonizes with what we already know about Denisovans. Once seen as a single Eastern Neanderthal-like group, Denisovans now appear as multiple deeply divergent ancestries spread across Asia and Oceania. If Denisovans were not one population, there is no serious reason to expect Neanderthals were one population either. The paper supplies an unusually blunt piece of evidence in that direction by demonstrating that the sequenced Neanderthal does not match the introgressing Neanderthal. This Denisovan split is another one of those quiet, technical details that completely changes what the out-of-Africa story is even allowed to mean. The key point is simple but explosive. The Denisovan genome we have sequenced from Siberia, the famous Denisova cave lineage, is not the same Denisovan lineage that actually contributed DNA to living people. The fact that these branches split deeply in time, 307,000 years ago, means there were multiple Denisovan lineages already separated long before any late Ice Age migration. So modern humans did not meet the Denisovan as if it were a single population. They met one Denisovan branch, while another branch is what fossil preservation randomly allowed us to sequence. This immediately undermines the clean simplicity that classic out-of-Africa replacement models rely on. Those models quietly assume Eurasia contained only a small number of archaic populations that modern humans briefly encountered on the way to global dominance. Those models are no more accurate than the recent reconstruction of Cheddar Man, which was created by the same people that pushed the replacement model. But the Denisovan split shows Denisovans were not a single homogeneous group spread thinly across Asia. They were a structured metapopulation, regional, separated, diverse, and evolving independently for very long periods. In practical terms, this means that Eurasia was not an empty stage waiting for a modern human wave to arrive. Eurasia was already a complex biological landscape, with multiple archaic branches distributed across different regions, interacting or isolating over immense spans of time. Once that is accepted, introgression can no longer be treated as a minor side episode. Denisovan ancestry becomes evidence of a deeper, repeated, geographically patterned process, most likely tied to South Asia rather than Siberia. The admixture event is no longer a single encounter with a known fossil population. It is contact with a missing archaic lineage, one that mattered more to living humans than the Denisovan individual we sequenced. This means the entire fossil genome anchor point of modern admixture modeling is biased by survivorship. We define Denisovan by what preserved in one cave, yet modern genomes reveal that the real Denisovan contributors came from elsewhere. Most importantly, this Denisovan split is not an isolated quirk. It implies the same principle must apply to Neanderthals as well. If the archaic DNA inside living humans does not match the archaic genomes we sequenced, then the idea of a single, neat interbreeding pulse collapses. The deeper truth is that modern human origins in Eurasia looks less like a clean replacement and more like a long-running network. Multiple expansions, repeated contact, founder effects, local selection, absorption of regional groups, and the survival of some lineages over others. And if the archaic world was structured, then a single neat admixture event is not just unlikely. It is conceptually incompatible with what genetics implies. Europeans did not emerge as a pure modern human isolate with a tiny archaic stain. They emerged as the survivors of a long Eurasian metapopulation process, repeatedly hybridized and repeatedly filtered, carrying forward only what endured. Thanks again for watching.